It is a Thursday evening in early April 1817. The village of Almondsbury sits 8 miles north of Bristol, in Gloucestershire, a county in the west of England, rolling farmland and stone villages set between the Severn estuary and the Welsh hills. It is a quiet place. The kind of place where strangers are noticed immediately. A woman appears on the road at dusk. She is in her mid-20s. She is wearing a black dress with a white muslin frill at the collar, a black shawl draped over her head like a turban, and a red and black shawl around her shoulders. Her hands are small and clean. She looks nothing like a beggar, but she appears to be wandering. She knocks at the door of the village cobbler. She speaks. Nobody understands a word she says. She gestures. She mimes. She is hungry. She needs somewhere to sleep. The cobbler's wife is unsettled. This person is not English, possibly not European, and the language she speaks is unlike anything the household has ever heard, and she is brought to the local overseer of the poor, whose job it is to deal with vagrants and strangers. The overseer takes her to the magistrate. The magistrate is Samuel Worrell. He is the town clerk of Bristol, a man of standing and education. His wife Elizabeth is American-born, well-traveled, comfortable in the world. They cannot understand the woman any better than the cobbler could. But they can see that she is young and apparently lost, and so they feed her, give her a room at the village inn, and resolve to investigate in the morning. During the night, the woman does something unusual. She refuses to sleep in the bed. She lays down on the floor instead. Over the next 10 weeks, this woman, whose real name is Mary Wilcox, daughter of a cobbler from Devon, will convince the magistrate and his wife, the gentry of Gloucestershire, the editors of Bristol's newspapers, the scholars of Oxford University, and eventually the reading public of Britain and America that she is a royal princess from an island in the Indian Ocean called Javasu. That she was kidnapped from her father's palace by pirates. That she escaped by throwing herself from the ship's deck into the Bristol Channel and swimming to shore. She will invent a language. A written script. A religion. A god named Alatala, to whom she prays from the tops of trees. She will fence, shoot a bow and arrow, swim naked in the Worrells Lake, and receive delegations of Gloucestershire gentry as though they are visiting her court rather than their own county. And she will be exposed, not by a brilliant detective, not by forensic examination, not by any scholarly decoding of her invented language, but by a landlady who reads a newspaper and recognizes a face. 3 questions will follow us through this story today. How did a woman with no education, no resources, no support network, and no plan beyond the next few days construct and sustain an identity so convincing that it defeated everyone sent to investigate it? What does it tell us about Regency England, its class structure, its intellectual vanity, its fascination with the exotic, that so many educated people believed her for so long? And what happened to Mary Baker after the curtain came down? And why is her story, one of the most extraordinary in British history, almost entirely forgotten? Before we go further, if this kind of storytelling is what you have been looking for, the subscribe button is just below this video. We cover true crime and hidden history from around the world, told with the detail it deserves. No sensationalism. No rushing through the facts. Just the full story, properly told. Hit subscribe, and you won't miss the next one. To understand the woman who became Princess Caraboo, we have to understand who she was before the turban. Witheridge, Devon, 1792. Mary Patricia Susan Wilcox is born between March 17, 1869, and November 22, 1952, in the village of Ermington in Devon, a rural county in the far southwest of England, a long way from anywhere that matters in the world she is born into. Her father is a cobbler. Not impoverished, but not comfortable. Devon in the 1869s is a world of limited possibilities: farming, domestic service, or marriage, ideally to someone with prospects. The idea that the daughter of a cobbler from Witheridge might one day sit for a formal portrait in the home of a magistrate, painted by artists who have exhibited at the Royal Academy, that is so far beyond the available imagination as to be literally inconceivable. Mary's childhood leaves her with one thing the world cannot take back, a quality of mind sharp enough to exploit every gap it finds. She notices things. She pays attention. She remembers. She watches how people behave and files the information away for later. She runs away from home at 16. From that point on, her life is a series of domestic service positions, working as a servant in houses across England. You wake before the family. You work while the family is awake. You are present in every room and acknowledged in almost none. You learn, by sheer proximity, how the class above you lives, speaks, eats, presents itself. You learn the vocabulary of gentility, the manners, the customs, the expectations, from the inside. This is Mary Wilcox's education. And it is more practically useful than anything she might have received in a school. The years before Almondsbury. The years between Mary leaving home and the April evening in Almondsbury are not well documented, but the outline can be traced. She works as a servant across England. Somewhere in this period, she has a child. The child is born in 1816. Both Mary and the baby are sent to a workhouse, St. Mary's Workhouse in London, and the baby is transferred to the Foundling Hospital. Mary visits him every week. In October 1816, the baby dies. This detail is rarely mentioned in retellings of the Caraboo story. It belongs to it. By February 1817, Mary is moving again. She wants to leave England. She wants to go to the Indies, to America, somewhere far from the life that has produced nothing but loss. She heads toward Bristol, which has a port and ships. She ends up on the road to Plymouth instead, begging, sometimes staying with Romani travelers she encounters along the way. She returns toward Bristol. She finds lodgings in a respectable house belonging to a woman named Mrs. Neal. She pays her rent and spends her days begging in the streets. She is looking for passage to Philadelphia. The fare is 5 guineas, an enormous sum, and she cannot find it. And then she notices something. French lace makers from Normandy are visiting Bristol. They wear high lace headdresses, and wherever they go, they attract attention. People stop and stare. People are curious. People approach them. Mary Wilcox looks at those headdresses and thinks attention is the only currency I have, and I am not using it properly. She takes her black shawl and wraps it around her head in a turban. And she walks toward Almondsbury. That is where the deception begins. Not with a master plan. Not with a calculated scheme. With a woman who noticed that looking foreign attracted notice, and decided to look as foreign as she possibly could. Regency England, the world she was walking into. To understand why what happened next actually worked, you need to understand the world Mary Wilcox was walking into in the spring of 1817. Regency England is a world of considerable tension and considerable imagination. The Napoleonic Wars have just ended. Britain is the dominant imperial power in the world, trading with and ruling over territories from the Caribbean to India to the Pacific. The idea of exotic foreign peoples, of unknown islands and distant kingdoms, of customs incomprehensible to European sensibility, all of this is in the air, in the books, in the conversations of educated people. The Romantics are at work. Byron has just published the 3rd and 4th cantos of Childe Harold. The imagination of the educated reading public is primed for the exotic, the mysterious, the other. When they encounter something that appears to fit those categories, they are not neutral observers. They want it to be true. Samuel Worrell is a magistrate and a well-read man. His wife Elizabeth is American, has traveled, knows the world. They live in Knowle Park, a comfortable estate in Gloucestershire. They are exactly the kind of educated, worldly, curious people who would be susceptible to a story like the one about to be constructed. Britain in 1817 is also nervous. The country has just spent 20 years at war with France, is wary of foreign agents and subversives, and simultaneously fascinated by everything arriving from beyond its shores. A woman who speaks no known language, wearing clothing that suggests Asia, appearing on a road in Gloucestershire, she is dangerous and fascinating in equal measure. She might be a spy. She might be a princess. This uncertainty is Mary Wilcox's greatest asset. She does not need to convince anyone of a specific story yet. She only needs to be convincingly inexplicable. The first night, getting it right immediately. The night at the village inn is where the performance is established, and the level of improvisation is extraordinary. When the landlady offers to cook supper, Mary declines everything except tea and bread. She holds one hand over her eyes while she drinks the tea, a gesture of prayer, which is exactly what it looks like. When shown her bed, she appears genuinely unable to understand its purpose and lies down on the floor instead. These two details, the prayer before the cup, the floor instead of the bed, are not random. They are the details of someone constructing a character with internal consistency, in real time. A person from a distant culture, with their own religious customs and different ideas about sleeping. The details have to be surprising but plausible, and they have to be consistently maintainable. She cannot pray before the cup tonight and forget tomorrow. She does not forget. When she notices a print of a pineapple on the wall of the inn, she points at it excitedly and says something that sounds like ananas, similar to the Indonesian word for pineapple, and to words for the fruit in several Asian languages. Whether Mary knows this or whether it is coincidence, the effect is immediate. The pineapple is exotic. She recognizes it. She must be from somewhere exotic. She is from Witheridge, Devon. The following morning, Mrs. Worrell visits her. Nobody can understand her language. Then, after considerable effort, the woman seems to understand what she is being asked. What is her name? And points to herself and says, Caraboo. The bureaucratic obstacle, and how she navigates it. Samuel Worrell is a magistrate. A vagrant who speaks no known language is, technically, a criminal matter. Vagrancy was a criminal offence in Regency England, and a homeless person with no visible means of support could be arrested and punished. Worrell has her taken to Bristol and examined by the mayor, then committed to St. Peter's Hospital, which in this era serves the dual function of a hospital and a workhouse, housing the destitute and vagrant. Here is where most people in Mary's position would have given up. She does not give up. She causes so many problems in the hospital, refusing to eat the food, maintaining her language and customs, attracting crowds of curious visitors who disrupt the hospital's operations, that the authorities give up on her and send her back to the Worrells. Within 2 weeks of being committed as a vagrant, she has been brought back to Knoll Park as a guest. The bureaucratic system, designed to process and dispose of people like her, has instead handed her back to the most comfortable situation she has ever been in. Manuel A. Nesso, the accomplice. About 10 days into her stay, a Portuguese sailor named Manuel A. Nesso appears. He has sailed the East Indies and claims familiarity with Malay dialects. He speaks her language. He tells the assembled company that the woman's name is not Caraboo, that is her country. She is a princess, he says. The daughter of a man of rank, of Chinese origin, from the island of Javasu in the Indian Ocean. She was carried in a palanquin on her father's estate, adorned with 7 peacock feathers. She was kidnapped from her garden by pirates, sold to the captain of a ship, and spent weeks at sea. When the ship came near land, she jumped. She had swum to the Gloucestershire coast. She had wandered for 6 weeks. And then she had knocked on the cobbler's door. Here is what almost nobody in existing accounts discusses adequately. Manuel A. Nesso and Mary Baker were almost certainly working together. Contemporary accounts later noted that they had both been lodgers at Mrs. Neal's boarding house before the Almondsbury episode. They knew each other. The sailor did not appear at random. A. Nesso provided the story. Mary inhabited it. Neither could have worked without the other. The performance at its peak. Once the Worrells believe they have a princess in their home, the household transforms. The gentry of Gloucestershire begin to arrive. They come in carriages, in pairs, in groups. They sit in the Worrells' drawing room and wait to be received. Caraboo receives them, she does not go to them. The power dynamic has inverted completely. The cobbler's daughter from Devon is holding court over the county's finest families, and they are grateful for the audience. She fences, and is good at it. She uses a bow and arrow with skill. She climbs trees. She swims naked in the Worrells' lake when she believes she is not observed. This becomes famous, reported in newspapers, a detail that simultaneously scandalizes and delights the reading public. She prays to Allah with one hand over her eyes, from the roof of the house. She eats only vegetables and drinks only tea. She produces a written script, she calls it Javanese, and when it is sent to the scholars at Oxford University for analysis, they describe it as a humbug language. They are right that it is invented. But later analysis shows it has consistent internal grammar. She had built a system, not just noise. The city of Bath throws her a ball. She dances. She sits for 2 formal portraits, one by Edward Bird, a Bristol artist who has exhibited at the Royal Academy, and one by Thomas Barker of Bath. These portraits are engraved and printed in the newspapers. They are what will eventually destroy her. But for now, the portrait sits on the wall. The visitors come and go. She is a national figure. From begging on the road to Plymouth in the rain, she has travelled to the drawing rooms of Regency England's gentry in 10 weeks. And nobody, not the magistrate, not his well-travelled American wife, not the scholars at Oxford, not the crowd of curious educated visitors, could say with certainty, she is not what she says she is. June 1817, the newspaper. In June 1817, approximately 10 weeks after Mary appeared in Almondsbury, a woman named Mrs. Neal opens her copy of the Bristol Journal. She reads the description of Princess Caraboo. She looks at the engraving of the portrait. And she knows the face immediately. She had rented a room to this woman. Months earlier, before the turban, before Almondsbury, before any of it. The woman had entertained her children by speaking in strange, invented syllables and wearing exotic dress. She had been an ordinary if unusual lodger. Mrs. Neal is not impressed by royalty. She is, however, aware of the difference between a princess and a former tenant. She contacts the Worrells. The confrontation is one of the most extraordinary scenes in this entire story. Elizabeth Worrell, who has hosted Caraboo for 10 weeks, who has come to genuinely care for her, who has been introducing her as a foreign princess to everyone she knows, sits down with Mrs. Neal and listens to what she has to say. Then she confronts the woman herself. And Caraboo speaks English. Perfect English. The accent of Devon. The vocabulary of a woman who has spent years in domestic service. She does not speak slowly or with difficulty. She speaks as herself, clearly and completely, and the voice is so different from everything the Worrells have heard from her in 10 weeks that Mrs. Worrell reportedly stares at her for a long moment before saying anything at all. The confession. The confession that follows is detailed and, in its way, remarkable. Mary tells the Worrells her real name. Where she is from? Her father is the cobbler. The running away at 16. The years of domestic service. The child who was born and died. The desire to get to America. The decision on a Bristol street to wrap a shawl around her head after watching the French lacemakers attract notice. She tells them about a Nesso, the plan they worked out together. The language she had invented, drawn partly from English sounds, partly from syllables she had heard from Romani travelers, partly from pure improvisation. She expresses, and contemporaries who were present said this appeared genuine, real remorse. She had not intended to go this far. The first night at the inn she had simply been trying to get through the night. Then the next day. Then the next week. And the system that should have removed her kept delivering her back to comfort and warmth and the most extraordinary experience of her life. She had kept going because it kept working. The Worrells absorb all of this. They are, by documented account, not angry. They are astonished. somewhat embarrassed, and, particularly Elizabeth Worrell, genuinely sorry for the woman in front of them. Because what Mrs. Worrell has just heard is not the story of a calculating villain. It is the story of a young woman who had lost a child, lost every position she had ever held, and made a desperate improvisational gamble that happened to work better than she could possibly have imagined. The press, and the public's response. The story breaks in the newspapers within days. And the British press does not treat the Caraboo hoax as a scandal about Mary Baker. They treat it as a scandal about the people she fooled. The newspapers are gleeful. They cannot get enough of the fact that a cobbler's daughter from Devon, with no education and no resources, spent 10 weeks being treated like visiting royalty by the educated gentry of Gloucestershire. The scholars at Oxford, the magistrate, the well-travelled American wife, the Bath Society who threw her a ball, all of them completely convinced, by a woman who had nothing to offer except intelligence and improvisation. The public reaction is predominantly one of amused admiration. She had done something daring and improbable and had won, at least temporarily. And the people she had fooled had, in the press's view, only been fooled because of their own vanity, their desire to believe they were hosting something exotic and significant. The class analysis is right there in the coverage of 1817, expressed without quite using those words. She had given the gentry what they wanted to see. And they had wanted to see it so badly that they had not looked close enough to notice it wasn't real. What the investigation actually missed. Samuel Worrell was not a foolish man. He was a magistrate, trained to evaluate evidence. He had sent the Javanese script to Oxford for analysis. He had brought in Manuel A. Nesso to translate. He had made inquiries of scholars and travellers who had been to the East Indies. None of this found anything definitive because it was all pointed in the wrong direction. The investigators were trying to verify the story A. Nesso had told. They were asking, is there an island called Javasu? Could a woman have swum to shore from a ship in the Bristol Channel? Nobody asked the simpler question, where was this woman 2 months ago? That question was answered not by any investigative process but by someone who happened to read a newspaper and happened to have met her before. The unmasking of Princess Caraboo was not the product of good investigation. It was the product of information eventually being in front of someone who already had the answer. This is worth sitting with. The investigation failed because it accepted the frame the performance provided and investigated within that frame. The Worrells asked, who is this princess? When the right question was, is this a princess? What Elizabeth Worrell did next. Elizabeth Worrell does something at this point that I think is the most interesting single action in the entire story. She forgives Mary Baker. And she pays for her passage to Philadelphia. Not because she has to. Not because it benefits her. She has every reason to be furious. Her social embarrassment is significant and lasting. She has introduced this woman as a princess to everyone she knows. And yet she looks at Mary Baker and sees, clearly, apparently, that what she is looking at is a young woman in genuine difficulty. A woman who has lost a child, has no family to return to, has no prospects in England, and whose only demonstrated skill is one that, now exposed, she cannot use again. Elizabeth Worrell buys Mary a ticket to America. Mary sails in June 1817. The ship is blown off course. It stops at St. Helena, the tiny South Atlantic island where Napoleon Bonaparte is in exile after Waterloo. And on the beach at St. Helena, a woman claiming to be Princess Caraboo appears. She is received by Sir Hudson Lowe, the British officer in charge of Napoleon's captivity. He is reportedly intrigued. He reportedly introduces her to Napoleon. Napoleon, by the accounts that filtered back to England, is reportedly enchanted. Whether the cobbler's daughter from Devon who spent 10 weeks as a Javanese princess actually met the former Emperor of France cannot be verified with certainty from the documentary record. But the story reached the Bristol newspapers, printed on September 13, 1817. It is either the most extraordinary coincidence in the history of the hoax, or it is exactly the kind of thing a woman who had just spent 10 weeks improvising would do if her ship happened to stop at the right island. America and the return. Mary arrives in Philadelphia and makes one attempt to revive the Caraboo Act, appearing on stage at the Washington Hall as Princess Caraboo. The audience is not impressed. Americans have a lower threshold for exotic royalty than the Gloucestershire gentry. She drops the act. She lives in Philadelphia for several years. What she does there is largely unrecorded. She is not a public figure. She is a woman in her mid-20s, in a foreign city, starting over. In 1824, she returns to England and tries the Caraboo Act one final time, exhibiting herself in New Bond Street in London, charging visitors a shilling. The act does not succeed. London in 1824 is 7 years past the original story, and the newspapers have reminded the public exactly who she is. She gives it up. She returns to Bristol. She meets a man named Richard Baker, 10 years her senior, and marries him. She becomes Mary Baker. She starts a business selling leeches. Leeches in the 1820s and 1830s are a genuine medical commodity used extensively in the practice of bloodletting, which the medicine of the era considers a treatment for almost everything. The Bristol Infirmary is one of her clients. Her daughter, Mary Ann, is born around 1829. The daughter will eventually carry on the leech business after her mother's death. Mary Baker dies on December 24, 1864, Christmas Eve, from a fall. She is 72 years old. She is buried in an unmarked grave in the Hebron Road Cemetery in Bristol. I want to take you inside the performance for a moment, because the more I look at it, the more remarkable it becomes. Mary Baker was constructing and maintaining what researchers call a total institution persona, an identity with its own internal logical system, consistent enough to survive prolonged scrutiny from multiple observers simultaneously. She did this without any training, any preparation, any time to think it through. She did it in real time, improvising responses to situations she could not have anticipated, maintaining consistency across weeks and dozens of separate interactions with different people. The language she invented is not random noise. It has internal grammatical consistency. The marks she made on paper, while correctly identified as invented by the Oxford scholars, are organized in ways that suggest a systematic approach. She was not making things up randomly. She was building a system and maintaining it. The physical details, the floor sleeping, the prayer over the tea, the climbing of trees to pray, the bow and arrow, are consistent with a coherent picture of a person from a culture with specific physical customs. Each new detail fits with the ones that came before. This is not the behavior of someone who wandered into a situation and got lucky. This is the behavior of someone with a genuinely exceptional ability to construct and inhabit a plausible alternative reality, in real time, under social pressure. Why they believed her, the psychology of the audience. The question I find more interesting than how Mary did it is why everyone else failed to stop her. The obvious explanation is the Romantic-era fascination with the exotic. The educated reading public was primed for stories of distant places and mysterious peoples, and Mary fitted perfectly into that imaginative frame. This is true, but it is not the deepest explanation. The deeper explanation is social. The people who hosted and investigated Caraboo were operating within a class system that made the real answer literally unthinkable. A cobbler's daughter from Devon could not be doing what Caraboo appeared to be doing. The social category uneducated servant girl improvising a royal identity simply did not exist in their framework for understanding the world. When you encounter something your framework cannot accommodate, you do not typically reach for the most socially inconceivable explanation. You look for the explanation that fits within your existing categories. And foreign princess of unknown origin was, in Regency England, a more conceivable category than working-class woman performing an improvised identity. The class system protected Mary Baker's deception because the class system could not see her clearly enough to recognize what she was doing. This is the mirror the Caraboo story holds up to Regency England. And it is not a comfortable one. The reframing insight, what Caraboo was really about. Here is what I think is the most important thing to say about this case, and it is something almost none of the existing accounts say clearly. Mary Baker did not fool the gentry of Gloucestershire because she was a uniquely brilliant con artist. She fooled them because she gave them exactly what they wanted. The Worrells wanted an interesting story. The gentry wanted an exotic visitor to receive. The newspapers wanted a sensation. The scholars at Oxford wanted a linguistic puzzle. Bath society wanted a ball with a foreign princess as the guest of honor. Mary provided all of it. She was producing, with extraordinary skill and almost no resources, an experience that everyone around her found valuable and that they were therefore highly motivated to accept without looking too closely. She had been invisible in every house she had ever worked in. She had spent a decade serving people who did not see her. And then she found a way to be seen, completely, totally, unavoidably seen, and the class that had spent years looking past her could not stop looking at her. According to scholars who later analyzed the case, Princess Caraboo had intuitively appealed to the aesthetic of romanticism that was emerging in Europe. People believed Mary looked and acted like their romanticized image of the exotic Orient. She had read the cultural moment and played it back to the very people who had created it. What the Caraboo story changed. The Caraboo hoax had a cultural afterlife larger than Mary Baker herself ever experienced. In the immediate aftermath, it produced a book. John Matthew Gutch, the editor of the Bristol Journal, published in 1817 a pamphlet called Caraboo, a narrative of a singular imposition practiced upon the benevolence of a lady. It sold widely, at 5 shillings a copy, and went through multiple printings. The frame it used is significant, a singular imposition on the benevolence of a lady. The victim of the story is Elizabeth Worrell. Mary Baker is the curiosity. This framing has been largely consistent in the century and more of retelling that followed. The story of Princess Caraboo is told as the story of a deception, and the analytical focus is almost always on the deception itself, on how Mary did it, on how she fooled people, rather than on the woman who did the doing. The question of what drove her, the lost child, the grinding poverty, the decade of invisible labor, the dead end of every conventional option, that context is rarely at the center of any account. Should it be? Class, gender, and the limits of visibility. Mary Baker's story is, at its core, a story about visibility. She spent a decade as a domestic servant, a category of person specifically designed by the social conventions of the era to be invisible. You do not notice the people who clean your rooms, cook your food, and carry your coal. You do not ask them about themselves. They are present in every room and acknowledged in almost none. The performance of Princess Caraboo is the inversion of this. It is the most visible a woman of Mary's class could possibly be. Every person who came to Knoll Park came to see her. Every newspaper account was about her. Every portrait was of her. For 10 weeks, the entire attention of Regency England's genteel society was directed at a cobbler's daughter from Devon who had spent the previous decade being not looked at. The class system that made her invisible was the same system that made the deception possible. And the class system that made the deception possible was the same system that found the story so delicious once it was over. The press laughed at the gentry for being fooled. But the press did not ask why the gentry couldn't see her clearly enough to recognize her. That answer would have been less comfortable than the joke. Mary Baker's account of herself. Mary Baker gave one substantial interview about her life, to Gutch, before he published his pamphlet in 1817. In it, she described her background and her motivations. She said she had invented the persona in the belief that it would make her life more interesting. That line appears in almost every account of this case. And it is almost always used to suggest that the whole enterprise was essentially frivolous, a young woman who wanted attention, who manufactured a story for excitement. I read it differently. A life in domestic service, 16-hour days, invisible labor, no prospects, a dead child, no money, no future, is not merely uninteresting. It is a life that the era's social structures have decided has no content worth acknowledging. More interesting might mean I wanted to exist in a way the world would notice. I wanted to be seen. I wanted to have a story that mattered. She found that story. It was temporary and it was built on invention. But for 10 weeks in the spring and early summer of 1817, Mary Baker existed in a way that no conventional domestic service would ever have allowed. What remains? Mary Baker is buried in an unmarked grave in the Hebron Road Cemetery in Bristol. The leech seller from Bedminster who was once Princess Caraboo of Javasu lies beneath ground with nothing to mark that she was ever there. Knoll Park still exists in Gloucestershire. Armonsbury is still there, 8 miles north of Bristol. The village where a woman appeared on the road at dusk with a turban and an invented language and nothing else. The portrait painted by Edward Bird, the formal portrait of Princess Caraboo, reproduced in the newspapers, the image that Mrs. Neal eventually recognized, hangs in a collection in Bristol. The woman in the portrait looks composed. Assured. She has the air of someone who has always been exactly who she appears to be. Which is, of course, the whole point. Mary Baker was born in Devon in 1792 and died in Bristol in 1864. In between, she worked as a domestic servant in houses across England, gave birth to a child who died, invented a country and a language and a royal identity, fooled the educated gentry of Regency England for 10 weeks, reportedly met Napoleon on a South Atlantic island, emigrated to America, returned to England, sold leeches to the Bristol infirmary, raised a daughter, and died from a fall on Christmas Eve without a gravestone. She wanted her life to be more interesting. It was. But the world, in the end, made sure she did not get to keep it. She deserved a stone. Subscribe to Enter the Crime and tell us in the comments, who do you think is really responsible for this deception working so long? Mary's performance, or the class system that made the people she fooled unable to see her clearly? And had you ever heard this story before today?